Hi, this is Lisa Anderson, president of ASCM Inland Empire Chapter, and also the president of LMA Consulting Group. I'm thrilled that we're kicking off our 2025 series, webinar series and programs with our new webinar series, Adapting Supply Chains for 2025, which there's a lot going on in the supply chain world. And so we're going to have a series of webinars. We're also going to be giving you a couple of key events that are coming up in April. And we're also going to be doing a member appreciation event in the spring as well. So we have a lot going on. And I'm thrilled to be here today with Eric Rose, who's going to kick us off with a presentation and discussion on reshoring from China to Los Angeles, a PPE case study. So for sure, reshoring and expanding manufacturing is key in today's world in supply chain. So Eric's company, Pinnacle Product Innovation, provides distributors and manufacturers with the expertise to move products from opportunity through development into market reality. His services offered include market research, product development, contract manufacturing, sourcing, R&D, project management, and product innovation. Basically, all things R&D, product innovation is the bottom line. And Eric has worked in the consumer, medical, and industrial product markets with companies including Baxter Healthcare. We have that in common, or at least we've both worked with them, me as a customer, Sunrise Medical, and Mattel. Eric also has a BS in product design, an MBA, and 35 years of experience in this field. So, and he's also an inventor with 50 patents worldwide. So really, really very impressive. And he's certified in new product development as a new product development professional. So with that said, I'd like to welcome Eric, and we'll go ahead and talk about reshoring.
Thank you, Lisa. My pleasure to be here today. Look forward to sharing this content with your group. Let me get this going. So today, I want to share a number of things.
Remember to like undim it or whatnot.
Okay. I'd like to share a number of, I think that's as strong as I can go.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah. Reshoring is a big topic. There are many decision influencers in the reshoring process. Certainly in the last couple months, there's been a lot more with tariffs, and we're going to talk about that briefly. But I think you'll find the takeaways, and I'm going to share this PowerPoint deck, or I did share this with Lisa, and she can share with you all the PDF. So you'll have the takeaways, guidelines, if you will, of what does it take to make a decision to move manufacturing from offshore, this example is from China in particular, to domestic. And again, this example is moving production to Los Angeles. So I hope this will be of value to y'all. My background, again, over 35 years experience, product design, development, manufacturing. I've been going to China relating to manufacturing work for over 25 years. I've taught product innovation at the university level for over 10 years. And for the last 5 years, I've been a product design expert witness as well. Some of the places I've worked, most notably Mattel. And the story that I'm going to be sharing with you today is primarily from a Los Angeles-based company called Moldex, a manufacturer of N95 masks. Today, we're going to talk about your supply chain issues. We're going to talk about reshoring specifically, give you the case study, and talk about considerations and takeaways so you'll have something to walk away with. And Lisa, will there be an opportunity where I can open it up to the floor for commentary?
Yeah, absolutely. If you have questions, we can go ahead and put them in the chat and or save them up, and we will, Eric, we can do it at interim steps. There's no reason why, it's always good to make things interactive, or we could do them at the end, whatever your preference.
There's a couple defined spots where I'm going to ask for some involvement.
Okay.
So just when you thought it was safe to go back in the water. I mean, you thought you had your supply chain issues back under control after COVID. Well, no, we've got a tariff whiplash going on. So there are numerous tariffs that are imminent starting tonight, as I understand, both from more local, nearshoring, if you will, that being Mexico and Canada, but most notably from China, even to the point where the de minimis packages, I think that's under $900, packages that used to be able to come in without any duties at all, that's going to change as well. So things are changing day to day. I don't have any definitive answers on what's going on other than it's supposed to start tonight. So I would like to kind of poll the audience, if you will. Anyone who's having any issues in regards to their supply chain, particularly in light of all of the tariff issues, if you could just unmute yourself and share for a moment anything, if you've got it, that would be very helpful. If not, we can move on, but I'd love to hear from you all, any key supply chain issues that you may have.
So you mean aside from tariffs? Is that what you're saying?
And tariffs.
Oh, okay. Well, we'll see if anyone has anything to add, but I would just say that what I'm seeing out there is that there's a lot of concern about the geopolitical risks and whether they're, and delays because of things like, if you're bringing product in from overseas, like there was issues with the Panama Canal because of droughts. There was issues with the Suez Canal because of the Houthi rebels. There was certainly delays with COVID. And so, those types of issues is, mainly what, and lead times, of course.
So I think your comment, Lisa, about geopolitical is a nice overarching umbrella to what are inevitable supply chain issues. And there's so many things that come off of that, including tariffs. So I think you're going to see me hit that a couple times here in the PowerPoint. So if no one else has anything, or
Well, it looks like,
yeah,
oh,
it
go
looks
ahead.
like, go ahead.
I have something. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Lisa, and I see we are just only about 4 of us here. Eric, thank you for a nice presentation. My comment is just going to be around offshoring. I was wondering if there is a way for us to get, year after year data on the amount of offshoring. That's juxtaposing between China and the US.
Yeah.
So
So
in percentages, yes.
most of that data, and I don't have the details in this talk today, most of that data is available from the US Department of Commerce. I believe it's the Trade Office, something like that, where they'll publish statistics of how many billions of dollars are going offshore to what countries. And often they're looking at it in terms of this idea of reciprocal tariffs, where how are we compared to, are we importing more from that country? Are we exporting more? Is it equivalent? So that data is available from the US government. The other organization I use is US Facts. Steve Ballmer, the former co-founder of Microsoft, has an organization now who publishes a convenient way to find, look for a lot of government statistics. So that may be another place you could look for it, but that's all I've got at the moment. Well, let's move on. So now that we know tariffs are imminent, what are we going to do? Well, I'm going to tell you this story about what I did prior to COVID, prior to tariffs, but it can set the stage for you and the people that you work with to look at the decisions around bringing back manufacturing to the United States. So this particular manufacturer is based in Los Angeles. He is a PPE, personal protective equipment manufacturer. Company is called Moldex. A number of their components are sourced in China. And as you might imagine, they've had supply chain challenges. And again, this predates COVID even. I was the company's director of research and development for 5 years, 2007 through 2011. So this is way before most of us even knew what PPE was. but this will help you to understand kind of the framework of this case study. What you're seeing in the pictures on the left are the items that would come in from offshore. You have a half mask respirator molded out of rubber with some carbon cartridges that do the filtration. So those carbon cartridges, think of a Brita water filter. It's essentially a plastic housing filled with carbon particulate with a lid on it. And instead of filtering water, this is filtering caustic gases, for example, in a factory that may have chrome plating going on or something to that effect. So these cartridges are the items that I ultimately was able to bring back to the United States. They're made up of the carbon itself, but the molded items that come in from China are the bodies. Think of it as a small cup and then a thin lid that sits on top of it. So in the US, they're filled and assembled. The lids are welded on to the bodies, and then they go into either the mask assembly or sold individually for refills. One of the other things that's important to understand in this particular case study is that this manufacturer actually had molding capacity available in Los Angeles. They were growing their capacity, they had plant and equipment available, and that was influential in the first place to even consider whether it would be viable to bring the production back from China to the US. So some of the issues that we were having, as you might imagine, when you're supplying, your supply chain is from offshore. Delivery lead times, they were long, they were erratic, and they were unreliable. So even if the supplier said, well, it's going to be 8 to 10 weeks, something could come up and 8 to 10 weeks turned into 10 to 12 weeks. Or if they got into their busy season, it could be 12, 14, or 16 weeks. We never really knew what we could count on, and it became quite problematic in and of itself. There were issues of minimum order quantity. So as you might imagine, when you're manufacturing something offshore, they don't want to run 1,000, 2,000, even 5,000 parts. They want to run 10,000 parts or more, depending on how big the parts are, how the tooling runs, etc. But they had large minimum order quantities. We had problems of quality control. So those cartridges have to be a particular brown, and they have to be round to get the lid on nice and snug. Well, those colors weren't always the brown we specified, and sometimes they had problems mixing the color properly, and we'd get a little bit of light brown lines and some dark brown lines because the color wasn't mixed well. Certainly the parts were coming in more oval than round sometimes, and we had problems with filling and putting the lids on. The other issue was the warehousing and the costs of having large minimum order quantities. So not only did we need more warehousing, but we need more cash to be able to hold the inventory. And that became problematic. So there were a number of issues that were driving what were we going to do with these items. So again, variable sales, particularly in the PPE industry where sales, with COVID went up really high, leveled off, came back down. Who knows where it's going to go, if we're going to have problems with, bird flu or jumping into humans, who knows? But we needed that quick reaction time. That was one of the decision points to be able to get rid of these long lead times and be able to have quick reactions. We needed to lower the minimum order quantity. We needed to lower the warehousing needs, and we needed to lower the cash on hand and have a better inventory turnover. Because with these large minimum order quantities, we might have an inventory turnover of 2. We'd buy maybe every 6 months, but that's not the way we wanted to run the business. We'd love to get to something like maybe an inventory turnover of 12, so we're buying monthly. or at least manufacturing monthly. Quality issues we've talked about. We also had some issues about rework. And now who's going to pay for rework? And is that going to be negotiated? Is that going to be problematic? The other thing that I discovered when I researched into what was it going to take to bring the tooling back to Southern California, I found that the tooling, the molds, the injection molds to make these plastic parts had already been automated by the Chinese. So the molds basically were opening and shutting, parts were dropping onto the conveyor, raw materials coming into the molding machine at one end, parts dropping down to the conveyor in the middle, going out to a finished good packing station. Very little labor. We didn't know that. So unlike maybe the masks, where those parts were stripped by hand out of the mold, these were already fully automated, and it looked like it would be relatively easy to repurpose that tooling and bring them back to Los Angeles.
Eric, I noticed that on my screen, I'm not sure if it's on everyone's screen, but the pictures on the left-hand side are covered up with a gray
Oh, I
bar.
see. So what's happening is at the Zoom, I moved the Zoom thing around. So is it still there?
Well, now it's at the bottom, but it's in a better position anyway.
Got it. So what's happening is the Zoom is putting the people in a bar that's now gray, but I get to see who's all here. So I don't know. Let me see if I can't hide it in a non-video. Let me see. Did that help?
Well, I could just, well, it's a little bit smaller. I mean, I could just tell you if anyone has any,
All right. All good.
puts
So
anything in the chat.
yeah, down below now, I think I've got it covered. Whoops, I just lost everything. Here we go. Okay. So we decided to move production to Los Angeles. We built inventory up ahead of advance to move because we knew that the move would take many months. We ended up moving the molds, which was tricky because we had to crate up the molds in the first place. And then we had to procure molding resin from a US source instead of the Asian source where our Chinese supplier had gotten the resin. We wanted a domestic source. And we had to build our own quality assurance plan. We had to make sure that the color was evenly dispersed. We had to make sure the parts were fully round, that we could weld them on without any rework. So all of this work was concluded, and we decided to move forward, and it took months to do this, but fortunately, we had enough inventory to be able to do it. So some of the key considerations and takeaways.
So I have a question, Eric. They allowed you to move your molds? That's surprising.
Yes, so good point. The tooling was built and paid for by us with an agreement that the tooling was ours. Now, part of the reason I believe they allowed us to move the tooling was because there were still many other parts that were high labor left behind in that factory. And these were automated, and we don't know for sure, but I don't believe they were making a ton of money on it. And it was a little bit of a strong arm because we had so much other business with them as well. But it's a good point. I always recommend to my clients that the tooling contracts are very clear, and if need be, written by a Chinese lawyer. And we had access to a Chinese lawyer if need be. And that all tooling is marked the property of, in this case, it would be Moldex Metric, Los Angeles, California, so that if anything ever happened in a bankruptcy or something to that effect, at least they know who owned the assets. But it's still tricky. It is still tricky. So let's go through some considerations. Intellectual property, whether you're concerned about the product being stolen or manufactured and sold out the back door, or the process itself. You may have some proprietary processes, like the manufacturing of N95 masks is a proprietary process. We're not going to send that to China. So whether it's product or process, it's important to protect your intellectual property, and you may choose not to offshore that because of it. If the product design state, meaning is the product design stable or is it brand new? Well, if it's brand new, you don't want to offshore it. I'm working with a company now, an electronics manufacturing company, had a very successful Kickstarter program, but they knew that the product was unstable yet, both in design and process. And while they may be bringing parts in, components in from offshore, the final assembly is still unstable and being manufactured in California. If the life cycle, if the life in market is going to be very long and it's stable, and it's a very laborious, you may consider keeping it offshore. But if it's a short life, for example, at Mattel Toys, some of those products, a number of them would only have a 1-year life. So if there wasn't much labor, it could conceptually be made in one of the Mattel factories, particularly in Mexico. That was very active. They had a couple active factories there. Whether the product is regulated or unregulated. So if it's a medical device regulated, let's say by FDA, or a respirator by NIOSH, those are products you typically don't want to offshore. The next consideration is this idea of value density. And we're going to spend a little more time talking about this, but at a high level, it's about the cube and the labor. So if the product has a high cube and a low labor content, probably better not offshored. But if it's relatively dense and a lot of labor, so it's a small cube, then yes, maybe better offshore because there won't be a lot of shipping costs. If the potential for automation is high and there might be labor, then sure, maybe do it domestic. But if there's a lot of labor and the automation potential is low, then maybe better offshore. Lead times, of course, if you've got erratic lead times, you don't want to do that offshore. And depending on your company's supply chain strategy, are you just in time or more concerned to have inventory on hand? Then inventory on hand, chances are you need to think about doing it domestic. Just in time, you're going to have a lot of inventory on hand if you don't have a reliable supplier. So again, you may want to manufacture domestic. And to Lisa's point, we had been talking about this idea of geopolitical issues. So whether it's tariffs or other issues, such as China threatening Taiwan, you may not want to source from Taiwan. You just don't know with geopolitical. You need to be prepared to consider sourcing domestically. So let me see if I can move on. So I want to dig in a little bit more to this idea of value density. So highly dense, high labor, better in China. Low density, something like a cat scratcher, which is very big, and moderate or low labor, generally better in the US or Mexico. So the item on the far right is one of the projects I worked on from Mattel, and that ultimately was able to nest all those parts. So it was a relatively low density package. The package was small. And so we were able to nest everything in the package. All the parts are snapped together. The big sub-assemblies are snapped together by the parent building this. So it was pretty much shoot and ship. There was some minor assembly, but the labor content was low, and it made sense in the end to just do it in Mexico. Even though there was some painting operations, they were simple, and we could do the whole thing in Mexico. So here's your takeaways. Highly sensitive intellectual property and process, made in the USA is preferred. Highly regulated, FDA, NIOSH, do it in the USA. If you can't shrink the cube, if you've got a very large package and the product is relatively low labor, do it in the USA. If you've got automation potential that's high and you know that you've got a long life in market, you're going to be producing a lot of these things, and you can automate, and the return on the investment of the capital equipment, do it in the USA. If you need a quick response to changing sales demand, manufacture it in the USA. If you don't want large quantities of inventory on hand, make it in the USA. So some of the content you'll see in this PowerPoint that's available. There's a nice article from from MIT Sloan School. McKinsey did a study on what does it take to deliver US manufacturing. You can check out Moldex and their website. There's a domestic organization called the Reshoring Initiative, which has a lot of great content about how to reshore. And last, very contemporary here, is what to do about the new Trump tariffs, which certainly will give you a lot of whiplash trying to figure out, but lowering your risk of tariffs will mean do it in the USA. So I hope this gives you a little bit of insight into what it takes to manufacture or bring manufacturing back to the United States and have these takeaways available for you to look at yourself, your company, and perhaps if you're a consultant, your clients, and have them consider bringing manufacturing back to the United States. Thank you very much, and I'll open it up if there are any more questions.
Yep. Well, thank you very much, Eric. Given, I mean, that's to your point, I completely agree. I mean, if it's automatable product, why wouldn't you be thinking about this, especially with, the tariffs and the geopolitical risks, et cetera. What are you seeing with your clients today? Are several of them thinking about it? Are they, I mean, I know that I think you were fortunate to get your equipment back. I think you have to think like you won't get it back. With that said, though, the labor rates, like if your product is really labor intensive, it seems like, Mexico has has great rates as well. So anyway, what are you hearing today?
The problem is
with
there's
clients?
tariffs, right? You've got
Say
tariffs
that
from
again.
Mexico that they're talking about 25% starting tonight.
Yeah, that's true. However, those tariffs are for, to fight the drug war. Now, that doesn't mean different tariffs, couldn't be talked about in the future. But, I think that's more of a negotiating tact. And when they get let's assume that they fight more of the drug war, I don't think that that's going to be long term. That's just my opinion. But I think that the region will be strong. That doesn't mean that, if you have if you have a product that's not high labor intensity, I certainly think the US is a much better choice personally. But if it's high labor intensity, I wouldn't be afraid of Mexico.
Right. So a lot of it also is designed for manufacturing. So when I was at Mattel, one of the things that we learned is, how do you take the labor out? So if it's going to go to Mexico, unlike China, where we were in situations in Mexico where they said, no, you've made that part very easy to assemble, but it's too tricky. And so we're going to break these parts apart and screw them together individually, and we'll just throw more bodies at it.
Well, you bring up a really good point, Eric, and you're a specialist in product development. So what would you say, I mean, this might be asking too much, but do you think 80% of products can be redesigned so that really they could be, at least automated to the degree that it would, make sense? Because there is a lot of, I am a strong proponent for moving manufacturing back to the US, because I think that there's, for every dollar you spend in manufacturing, you add almost $2.70 to the economy. And it's, it's really important to national security and geopolitics. And, I could go on and on. I mean, that's a really good point. Do you think, I mean, I'm making up that statistic, but you're the expert. So what do you think?
I don't know the numbers, but I can tell you, looking at manufacturing, and even this came up last week when I was in a factory in Silicon Valley. If you're making onesie twosies, that's a custom product, it's irrelevant. But if you're starting to make 1,000 a month, 10,000 a month, these are numbers that really make a difference about automated assembly, designed for manufacturing, even simple things like last week it came up on the factory floor. You don't want to have a part that you have to turn over and assemble some stuff, then turn it back and assemble some stuff, turn it around and assemble some stuff. all of that has to be, Mattel was pretty good at doing what's, like a top-down assembly. So you'd have a base plate, and then all the parts would go on the base plate, and then a cover, and you'd screw the cover down and maybe cover it with a label on top. So
That's a good point.
those are very important things to consider. And I
Yeah.
always ask my clients, do you plan on making, 100 a month, 1,000 a month, 10,000 a month? And then
Yeah.
the materials you choose, the design methods, the manufacturing for components, all of that is different depending on the volume.
So really what I hear you saying, it's a really interesting point, is that it's less about, is the product high labor content? I mean, I guess in my mind, I was assuming, to your point, I was not thinking that they would design it that way, but it really makes a lot of sense. If you design it well from the beginning and or redesign it, you can probably make, my guess is you could probably make most products reasonable with X volume, like you said, 1,000, whatever it is. I mean, because that volume makes up a lot of
The statistics show
issues.
something like 70 to 80% of the product cost is baked in during the design.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
that makes sense to
if
me. That's very interesting.
if it's not top down, if it's got a lot of screws going in from the side, if you are turning this thing upside down, if you're not designing it to be manufactured maybe with a mold that's got multiple cavities in the mold and parts just pop out automatically, and the part was never designed to do that, then sure, you're setting yourself up for failure if you're trying to reshore.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Really good point. And it's encouraging, because really it means that I mean, the nice thing about the US, which is why China, for example, wants to keep selling into the US, is that we have volume, we have scale, generally speaking. I mean, certainly for a startup organization, you may need to outsource production until you can get to some sort of a reasonable volume. And to your point, it also relates to design, because if you have like 18 million SKUs and you don't need that many items, relates.
Yes, and even a startup who, like this client of mine, they use a contract manufacturer.
Yeah.
They're still going to be charged a lot of money if it's labor intensive. But if they can design
Yeah.
it so that it's, let's call it design for manufacturing, where it's simple assembly, it may take some jigs and fixtures and maybe some other tooling and certainly a lot more
Yep.
thought process in design. So again, is it 100 units a month, or is it 1,000 units a month, or 10,000?
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And I know another key issue when it comes to reshoring could be like your source of materials and components and those types of things. So it just means to me that the more folks that think about and reshore, the less problematic that's going to be. And you need to start doing this now, regardless of if you're not going to do it for like 2 years, let's say, although I would recommend you do it sooner. But you have to start thinking now, because to your point, it could take time to design it, find new sources of supply, those types of things. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll give you another example. This new client of mine, they've come up with a domestic CNC bending company that can take sheet metal, stamp it, laser cut it, and bend it. And it's all online. You just send the CAD file there and they send you parts. The other thing that came up was this is the first time I've worked on a project where they've sourced components through domestic 3D printing. So
You're right.
There is no tooling. They
You're
send
right.
them
Like
out to the 3D printer and they get parts back that are 3D printed and that are going into the assembly for production.
Well, and isn't 3D printing like a good option for like small runs as well, right? Because
Exactly.
that's the ideal.
Yes.
I mean,
No
they even
tooling.
make I don't know, it's like an aerospace engine, maybe. I mean, they make some big things in 3D printers, so it's not like you just have to make a simple part.
Yes. So these are plastic parts, and there's numerous plastic options now for 3D printing, everything from rubber-like to very rigid, stiff structural engineering type materials. but the 3D printing of metal parts now is growing rapidly in the domestic market here. So there are contract manufacturers of 3D printed metal parts. So you don't need tooling, and you can do things in those 3D printed parts that just get you up and running quickly. And if your design changes, there's no tooling changes. And these are great ways of trying to keep manufacturing domestic.
Yeah. Yeah, very good point. Does anybody have any questions? You can either put them in the chat, or you can unmute yourself, and I will call on you. Oh, I see Sean has a question.
Hey, well, first of all, I wanted to thank you, Eric, for your information. I'm not in production; I'm in transportation, but it's good to hear the other side of it. Wish more people were here because I think it's valuable information. But what do you think? Like, where do you think the next? I mean, how can I put this? So production has kind of moved from place to place: Vietnam, India, China, all these places. Like, basically they're chasing the dollars of savings. Where do you think the next place is going to be?
I don't know, because I know that a number of suppliers were trying to set up in Vietnam. One of my friends was Vietnamese, and he was talking to me about the growth of Vietnam and the reduced financial implications. So tariffs are not, right now, they're not in Vietnam from what I understand. But the logistics, they don't have the roads and the ports and so forth. And that's problematic. So I don't really know where it's going to go. I think with all of the tariff talk going on, there is going to be a resurgence in American manufacturing, but it's going to have to be really smart. You're going to, to your point about transportation, I want to see that my final assembly house has its suppliers near the final assembly, that we're not shipping parts cross country only to ship them back to a customer, from where the components came from. So the idea of distributed manufacturing, especially if it's 3D printed, you can do that anywhere. I think transportation logistics are going to be more and more important in order to minimize the costs of those parts of the total delivered product, and keep it in the USA. So I think there's going to be a lot of resurgence in how do we smartly manufacture in the US.
I mean, I agree, and I would add to that I think that's very true. Although there are a lot of products already that go not just across the US, but across the world and back multiple times. So going across the US and back would be an improvement. However, I would definitely advocate for what you're saying, Eric, to be smarter about how you do it. But I would add to your question, in my research and understanding, in my other business, is that Vietnam is definitely one of the more popular places. However, Vietnam is largely, there's a lot of it that's controlled by China. China's manufacturers just moved to Vietnam to avoid the tariffs, right? So there's still problems there, not just with tariffs, but with geopolitical issues. Also, they don't have the scale or the advanced, I mean, they'll catch up, but they don't have the advancements that China has, and they don't have the scale that China has. So there's some issues there. That's somewhat the same story with Southeast Asia, because it depends on what product it is, but some of the Southeast Asian countries will definitely be popular, but depending on your industry and that type of thing, but they have the same issues as Vietnam. The other one that comes up a lot is India. And there's actually, I just finished a research, well, I didn't, my research analyst finished a project on India, and she said that as much as talk as there is about India, there isn't actually a lot of proof that people are actually moving there yet. But there is there's a lot of manufacturing and focus on manufacturing in India. And I've had a client that moved to Vietnam, and then after they moved to Mexico, actually. But I've had other clients that are getting supplies from India. And India has a lot of advantages over like China, because they're more, they're not communist, they're more friendly, that type of thing. But they do have infrastructure issues. They do have a border with China, and there's fights over, natural resources. And they, the long lead times and some of those, they
It's
have
still
some of the other
long.
geopolitical risks, etc. So I would just add that about India. But I think that the best alternative, well, I agree completely with Eric, actually. Number one would be the US. And now I'm on Eric's page. You should really go to Eric, help him get you to redesign your products. Or use your internal talents. But I think there's a lot to be said for the US manufacturing. But I think a good backup is Mexico, because they do have scale. They've been gaining, skills. And I believe that the region will perform together. I mean, there'll be tariffs here and there, as we work through issues like the drugs and the border. But to Eric's point, I think you just have to evaluate your situation. But I think Mexico is a good backup / go to both places. Depends on what you need.
Well, especially if you're manufacturing with, CNC and 3D printing, and you haven't built giant factories or, large tooling, then you can be more flexible and have more backups and multiple sources.
Yeah, I agree. Well, and it looks like, Sean, it looks like you said here something in the chat. So let's see. Oh, wow. We have like different things going on here. Well, Tony Sefer said new tariffs will increase the cost of imports or increase demand for U.S. suppliers, who will then increase prices, causing inflation. So yeah, that is the talking point, right, Eric? But I'll let you answer it, and I can always add to it.
It is the big concern. Again, I hope that the PowerPoint, this presentation, gives you guidelines for when do you reshore. So the very high labor, low packaging cube may still, even with tariffs, be advantageous to do offshore, but not necessarily if it's low labor and low cube, high cube. So then US or Mexico is going to make a lot more sense.
Well, and I would add to that you have to be, if you're concerned at all about any information in your company being secret, like that you don't want the Chinese government or anyone in China to know about, by no means can you go to China. So that's another thing to add. Now, if you have like a product that like doesn't matter because, it's simple, like doesn't matter, and it's, high labor, like Eric's saying, it's still, there's no reason to bring it back. I would just say you better get a backup anyway, in that case, at a minimum. But like, that would be the only case where I would think, well, even the China expert that we've had on this program before says like you really should get out. But China produces at scale and they're the #1 in the world. So you're not going to like snap your fingers and do that. So I would worry less about that type of product, but I would get a backup in place if you want to stay in business. And then the other thing I would add to Tony, to your question is that there are, it depends on the reason for the tariffs, like the negotiating tariffs. If they don't go into effect, it's not going to impact things. Certainly some tariffs will go into effect. And if it's reciprocal tariffs, like the tariffs could actually go down. If like, for example, Europe puts a 10% tariff on cars and we put a 2.5%, if they wanted to go down to a 2.5%, like that would actually reduce the cost. However, I do believe that tariffs will overall, if they're from China, the going experts in that field think that the Chinese companies will largely absorb most of the tariffs because they don't want to pass on the cost, because they want to do business in the US and they don't want to lose their business. If it's other places, like it's hard, it's going to be mildly inflationary because some of these tariffs will go into effect. But that's what I would add. And I do agree with Sean, what you put here. You said you would argue that these jobs will increase jobs and salaries and overall raise the standard of living. Well, that is what I was saying. For every dollar invested in manufacturing does add $2.70 to the economy. So that will start adding up. So it's a tricky equation, right? There's no easy answer here. Now let's see what, Antonia, I see you said something else. Is contract manufacturing a winning business in the USA due to tariffs? Well, what do you think about that, Eric?
Well, I do know that the contract manufacturer I was at last week in Silicon Valley is expanding.
Yeah.
So can I directly relate it to tariffs? I can't do that. But the fact that they're expanding in the Silicon Valley in contract manufacturing um, is a nice sign. And I
Yeah.
hope that more and more small businesses realize that there's opportunities in the market, and while they can't afford their own factory, they can still have fat enough margins to be able to have a contract manufacturer produce their items in the USA.
Agreed. And I have I'm in a group of CEOs, and at least one of them does contract manufacturing of plastic injection molding items, and he's seen like upticks for the same reason. Like you said, Eric, you can't. I mean, no one in their right mind is going to say I'm reshoring my production because I, don't want to, do business with you long term, because then of course your China supplier is going to cut you off. So you'd have to be, dumber than a door and stump, or whatever the saying may be. So they're not saying that, but they are looking to expand manufacturing. So I do agree with you that I think contract manufacturing could, make a comeback. All manufacturing should make a comeback.
Again, just do it smart.
Yeah, and
Yes, I would agree.
I personally see everything from a transportation perspective. So then, of course, I'm looking at, that's more private fleets, maybe. You have companies that have their own private fleets, or more freight volume for drivers and truck transportation companies. So I kind of look at it from that, because right now, I saw a video the other day. It was showing a guy, he made brass fittings, and he was showing how he can make it for 26 cents a part, and China can make it, he can make it for 32 cents a part, and China can make it for 26. I'd rather pay the 6 cents extra and know that it was made in the United States by American workers, and we're taking care of our people first. And yeah, it's going to cost a little bit more, and it's going to be a little inflationary, but if we're also providing more jobs and higher paying jobs, I think that will offset it more than the inflation. If you have 2%, 3% inflation, but you have, a 5% rise in, standard of living, I think that, and I'm all about, America first too. So.
Well, I think the soft costs, to my point earlier, don't end up in a bill of materials on the cost sheet. So inventory carrying costs, minimum order quantity, quality problems, damage in logistics, shipping, all of that doesn't really end up on a cost sheet. It's a soft cost often, or some buried in overhead. And I would argue that the difference between 26 and 32 goes away in a heartbeat if you really could capture those soft costs.
Yeah, I agree. And actually, you're right. From a transportation perspective, I do think there's going to be opportunities for sure from a transportation point of view. If you look at it at the really high level, theoretically, the container shipping, which I know Elizabeth relates to the ports. I mean, theoretically, that'll go down over time, but by no means is that going to be like reducing anytime soon. So, but I do believe that we can, there'll be robust increases in both manufacturing and like LTL, over the road trucking.
I have one question, Eric. What about nearshoring? Actually, nearshoring from the perspective of, because this has also to do with the value density, transportation, and all of that. We had NAFTA, which was the agreement between Mexico, Canada, and the United States, and of course, these three countries have profited from that over time. How is that affecting this whole, tariff, being imputed in the ecosystem, and with the whole idea of, offshoring? Obviously, that's gonna, attract some nearshoring, capabilities from the point of view of, value density, since, of course, Mexico and Canada are very, very close by. So how is that playing out right now that we have all these conversations around tariffs and things like that? Any ideas?
It's concerning to me that we're talking about a 25% tariff on Mexico and Canada, and only a 10% on China for now. It seems a little backwards, but I'm not sure how they got those numbers. So I don't know about nearshoring and the math. If we add 25%, does it still make sense to do it in Mexico? Certainly, when you talk about avocados, I don't see us growing a lot of avocados in the US compared to Mexico, other fruits and vegetables. But if you're talking about manufacturing, well, maybe with 25% tariffs, we're going to do it in the USA. I don't know yet. It's too early to tell in my mind.
Well,
Very
I would
good.
agree. I would add to that, that I think, I mean, this is just my take on it. So by no means, no means am I an expert or have inside information, but listening, to what the administration is saying, they're saying that these tariffs relate specifically to the border and drugs. And I think what's going on here is that they fully expect that Mexico and Canada will work with the US to fight the border issues and the fentanyl issues. And if they do, those tariffs aren't going to go into effect. So, or they'll be reduced dramatically. So I think that it's a negotiating stance, because that was the number one thing that Trump campaigned on. When it comes to China, these tariffs are not related to equal trade or anything. They're related to drugs again, because they make the precursors for
Right.
the fentanyl drugs. And so they put 10% on. China didn't change anything, so they put it in place, where they postponed the 25% ones. And then they're threatening another 10% because they want them to do something about these drugs. But again, it has nothing to do with, in the administration's mind, it has nothing to do with fair trade or, like the costs of products. It has simply to do with, are you going to help us fight this drug war because people are dying? At least that's the administration's point of view. So I believe that whether Mexico and Canada have tariffs tonight, possibly, but will they be in long term? I doubt it, because they are doing something to fight this war, and they just, it's just what more are they going to do? Is that's what I think is going to happen. So I think that Mexico will be achievable. Like, there's no way that I think 25% tariffs are going to go into place for the long term, is what I'm saying. Like when it comes to the automobile industry, there's like a lot of problems, because it's one of the other things that the administration's been like campaigning on. However, there's integrated supply chain, so that'll be a tricky issue. But I think the idea is, if we can resurge American production and not make things worse, I think it's, these tariffs will go away. But they are, like, certainly the topic of conversation. So I don't know, Eric, you can correct anything that you think that.
No, I just think no matter what you're going to do, you need to have smart product design, simple manufacturing, and a backup.
I totally agree with you, because even if you go to Mexico because you believe what I'm saying is true, to that point, it doesn't matter. You need a backup regardless. And it's not, there is going to be a tariff threat, long term. It doesn't matter who's president. And so if you can redesign your products over time and make them be produced as effectively in the US, why not?
Exactly.
Right. But, that's long term. But I do believe we'll be friendly. There'll be nearshoring with friendly partners. I mean, you're not going to be a completely isolationist or anything. I think we're just trying to I think it's just trying to get some of the national security kind of concerns and manufacturing booming with the economy again.
And I like the idea of, nearshoring, because if I need to get on a plane to fix something, I'd rather go to Tijuana or, Toronto than having to go to Taiwan or, somewhere in Shenzhen.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, very good. Well, thank you for everybody for joining us today. Thank you, Eric, for your for the fascinating presentation. And we've sent out a note. We're going to keep the next 3 months of webinars in front of you. And as I said, in April, there's a couple other partner events that we're going to be communicating. So please check us out at APICS, APICS-IE.org, or I think it's Inland Southern California, ASCM.Inland Southern California, I believe. But start with the other one, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Thank you again to Eric.
My pleasure.